All right, good morning, good morning. Welcome into ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for making us your SEC football show of choice. Woo! We're off and running on a Tuesday. The SEC Insider Hit this morning is brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Mississippi. It's good to be blue. The official healthcare provider of the Out of Bounds show. We're streaming live on the Out of Bounds radio app, and you can find us right now on YouTube. Our YouTube channel. Search Out of Bounds Sports. You can watch the show. See what all we have going on in the studio and on the set. It's looking good, looking good. I did a radio interview with Shane Matthews last week, Blake. Shane Matthews from Pascagoula. He was part of that 1987 state championship team with Terrell Buckley. He's now in Gainesville, Florida. He went on to play for like 15 years in the NFL, signed with the Florida Gators, played for Spurrier. His dad passed away last week, one of the legendary Mississippi high school football coaches. And that was a lot of fun to hang out with Shane and talk, discuss Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss and Mike Leach and MSU and Dan Mullen, since he'll always be tied, just like other coaches that come and go. He'll always be tied to the state of Mississippi. So I enjoyed that. Shane's got a podcast going now. Shane Matthews, Pascagoula. Well, he's from the Delta, and then his dad eventually took the job at Pascagoula. And that was a big deal, Blake. What was happening on the coast then was crazy. Chris Jackson, Gulfport, in hoops. And then that Pascagoula team with Shane Matthews, Terrell Buckley, among others, they won it all. And then Shane goes to Florida. Buckley goes to Florida State.
That's a loaded roster when you think about that.
There are other players on that. Pascagoula went through a stretch where the shipyard, they had enough people, bodies, obviously parents with kids, where, they were producing some serious talent at that time. Down on the coast. Chris Jackson at Gulfport. Unbelievable. The Out of Bounds Show, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. All of our guests join us on the Miller Lite guest line. We are live in the Bank Plus studio. Excited to welcome in Dr. Larry Field, shoulder and elbow specialist with Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center once again. Dr. Field, good morning. Welcome in.
Hi, Bo. Nice to see you. Nice talking to you.
Well, Dr. Field, thanks for taking some time today. We cover, players year-round and sports injuries, but there is something about the NFL draft that it's like magnified because people are following their players from the SEC or another conference, and then they're following them to the NFL. And, of course, we always have guys from Mississippi State, Ole Miss, the surrounding schools, Bama and LSU, that are fighting or recovering through a sports injury. And so we had a couple of listeners ask about the shoulder labrum surgery. And we've had Jonathan Abram from MSU. We've had Benito Jones from Ole Miss. And we would like for you to walk us through, describe, first of all, the surgery. And then we'd like to get into the rehab and the comeback and what is to be expected, especially from these world-class athletes, Dr. Field.
Yeah, sure. Great. Happy to do that. The reality is that there's a wide spectrum of injury to the labrum. The labrum, really all it is just like a rubber washer that goes around the edge of the socket. But what attaches to that labrum is all the ligaments of the shoulder, and they're, of course, critically important to stability and function. So when these athletes get injuries to the labrum, what that usually means is the labrum gets torn off of its connection to the socket. And so what you have to do is basically reattach that. And we can use a little camera, an arthroscope, to accomplish that. And that's a fairly straightforward surgical intervention. We do it all the time, every day here. But the reality is that to get an athlete back, like an Abram or some other high-level athlete, back to the level of function that's necessary to compete at that level is a challenge. And it takes a number of months, and there's some sophisticated rehabilitative protocols that we have to utilize.
Dr. Larry Field, Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center on the Out of Bounds Show, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Are there times where athletes choose, especially at the Power 5 NFL level, to play through an injury depending on the severity, Dr. Phil?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, for example, if a labral injury occurs, it can result in a shoulder dislocation. And that's often what we do is fix a labrum to stop that from continuing to recur. But a lot of athletes can manage their instability, their shoulder looseness, through the course of the season with bracing or rehabilitation, get through the season, and then maybe consider an operation at the end if necessary. So depending on the position, a lot of athletes can, in fact, manage that shoulder problem. Benito Jones, for example, could manage it a lot better than a quarterback or somebody that needs to have their arms overhead.
Makes sense. What with a Jonathan Abram, you go ahead and have the surgery, and then you throw yourself into rehab and PT. I know this varies human to human, but what is the timetable for an athlete like that, Dr. Phil?
Yeah, well, like Abram is a safety, and so he has to have excellent range of motion, overhead, and that type of thing. It's going to take longer for him to get in a position to be able to perform at the level he needs to perform. But I think if things were to go well and there were no complications or problems, then I think probably within 3 or 4 months, he would be not only functional enough, but healed well enough, especially if he had some type of supplemental brace or something to get back onto the field.
Okay. Out of bounds, ESPN 1059 The Zone. We're visiting with Dr. Larry Field, Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center, shoulder and elbow specialist. All right, I want to switch gears here. It's supposed to be baseball season. We're hoping that it's Major League Baseball season here in the next month or two. And again, we as fans covering our teams run into players on the diamond that run into arm, shoulder, and elbow injuries. And so this has been a discussion for a long time as far as youth baseball, pitch count, resting arms, limiting arms, how much is too much, what they can do, and so forth. As a shoulder and elbow specialist, where do you start as far as youth baseball and working that arm too much? Too little wouldn't be it. Where do you start as far as working the arm, the shoulder, the elbow too much, Dr. Phil?
Yeah, it's in the last few years there have been some fairly well-defined recommendations as it relates to youth sports and youth overhead athletes, basically pitchers. And so there are specifically defined criteria. For example, for a young athlete, 7 or 8 years old, a pitcher, usually the recommendation is less than 50 pitches per day, and that increases significantly and subsequently over older ages. For example, a high school senior probably could throw 100 or 105 pitches per day and get away with it. And the more pitches one throws per day, of course, the higher the necessity for rest. So for a young pitcher, they may need more rest for less pitches than an older pitcher. But if a pitcher throws, for example, less than 50 pitches, 1 day of rest may be all that's necessary. But if one throws 75 pitches or more, up to 4 days of rest is often recommended.
And then Dr. Larry Field, Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center on ESPN 1059 The Zone. What is your approach on breaking balls?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes up a lot. And, I think, honestly, a really good quote that Jim Andrews, of course, a famous orthopedic sports medicine surgeon, gave was he says that athletes shouldn't throw curveballs until they shave. And I think there's some wisdom there because we all know that a 14 or 15-year-old may vary a lot in their physiologic development, their physical development, their neuromuscular control, for example. And so I think that it's important that athletes be strong enough and have enough control to be able to throw curveballs. But I'll tell you, importantly to me, even maybe more importantly, is the mechanics related to that, to throwing a curveball.
Yeah.
For an athlete who has poor mechanics, I think they can throw much less number of pitches or type of pitches than an athlete that has good mechanics. And that can be a challenge in younger athletes to teach those good mechanics, but I think it's very, very important.
Do you agree with shutting it down, quote unquote, for around 90 days a year, especially at 10, 12, 14, 16 years old, Dr. Phil?
Yeah, I typically recommend that. When I played baseball when I was a young kid, and we just by default were off several months a year, and that's different now. And I think it's related to subspecialization. But we know that subspecialization, that is focusing on one sport only, can increase the risk of injury. And so I do recommend to my parents and the athletes that they try to take a few months off a year if at all possible. I also try to inspire these adolescent pitchers to not only have fun playing baseball, but to play other sports as well. It's good for them physically, and it may open up opportunities they've not yet considered.
You're listening to the Out of Bounds Show. We're visiting with Dr. Larry Field, shoulder and elbow specialist, Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center. Blake, you have a question for Dr. Field?
Yeah, Doc. We accept in baseball that you can't you have to ramp up as a pitcher, right? Like spring training, your first bullpens are smaller than your next bullpens. Your first start is 2 or 3 innings. Your next start's 5 or 6, and so on and so forth. So can that theory then be translated to like a pitcher's career, as in to say if you don't throw enough as a younger pitcher and you're overcautious, can that then hurt you when you try to get to an elite level and pitch full games? Does that make your arm less strong or less muscle prepared, so to speak, to pitch those types of pitches? Do you have to ramp up your career the same way you ramp up for a season?
Well, it's a great question. There's controversy about that, but some shoulder surgeons like me think there are only so many pitches in an arm to start with. And so if you see some of the successes that pitchers have had in the major leagues and their relative paucity of throwing early in their careers, it suggests that maybe there's something to be said for that. I think that the ramping up also relates not just to cumulative throws over a career, but also in a season, individual season as well. So that's not well defined, but I would argue that the less demands you actually put on the shoulder, statistically, the more likely you'll have a durable career.
Okay. What is the Dr. Larry Field on ESPN 105.9 The Zone? What is the average rehab for Tommy John surgery, Dr. Field?
Well, that's a good question. We see so many of these ligament injuries in the elbow now, and it depends on the operation that we do. If we do a reconstruction, that is, take the graft from somewhere else in the person's body or another person, and we use it to reconstruct the ligament, that rehabilitation is anywhere from 9 to 12 months. We do have new techniques and new operations for certain indications that we can avoid the graft altogether, and we know that the recovery can be quicker in that setting, really 6 months or sometimes even less. So there are some new things in our armamentarium, so to speak, in dealing with these that require surgery, but it is a long recovery, and it gets back to the point about the demands on the elbow or the shoulder after an operation. It's really, throwing a baseball is not a normal activity. It's not a normal physiologic activity. Our bodies aren't necessarily designed for it, and it puts some incredible demands on the shoulder and elbow as a consequence. In fact, throwing the baseball is the fastest activity, 7,000 degrees per second of rotation, than any other activity in our body.
Oh, wow. Okay. Dr. Larry Field, Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center on the Out of Bounds Show. So let's just take the early 90s, Dr. Field, when you were working with the New York Mets. Did you foresee a day where your specialty and profession would be doing surgeries where young men would be coming back from these type surgeries and playing for another 5, 10, 12 years at a high level, especially on the pitching mound?
I'm a real optimist about the potential of science and the potential of surgical intervention and the techniques that we develop over the years. And back then in the 90s when I was in New York, we did do Tommy John surgery, but we had different techniques, but we were actively developing new techniques. I even designed a technique way back then. And so we've seen as a consequence the improvements that, not just in the surgical intervention, but in the rehabilitation protocols that allowed this to happen. So it is a little surprising because of the extreme demands on the elbow, for example, with this operation. But at the same time, I'm happy to see that athletes are able to have these long and durable careers as a consequence.
Would you describe or walk us through with our listeners preemptive Tommy John?
And I'm sorry, what do you mean?
All right, Blake.
Yeah, Dr. Phil, I've seen where there's a big debate about whether or not parents should have their kids get their elbows operated on before showing major signs of Tommy John in order to avoid a blowout, because they're now saying you can come back stronger after the surgery. You can throw harder after the surgery.
Goodness.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a good question, but the reality is that I think that to do surgery because we anticipate there might be a problem would not really fit into the indications that I use or others would use. I would argue that the reality is it's not necessarily the case either. If athletes who have a Tommy John operation and do well as a consequence and are able to throw well after that operation, I would argue it's more likely that they had a kind of a brewing, long-standing problem that limited their ability to throw before the injury, before the surgery. So I think that it's probably wise to do all we can to avoid an operation in a setting like that, in part because the operation isn't a guarantee. You know, we have good success statistically, but I'd say at least 1 or 2 out of 10 athletes that go through that long and tortuous process are never able to get back to that same level or an improved level of performance.
So, Dr. Field, we just received a text from a listener, and it piggybacks off of what you were talking about a few minutes ago. Bo, I started throwing curveballs at 11, tore my arm up my freshman year of college, never played again.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. You know, 11 is a really young physiologic age. The growth plates are still open. There's a lot of development that has to happen there. And it's hard to teach an 11-year-old proper mechanics, partly because they're maybe not strong enough to throw a curveball, or they don't have enough neuromuscular or core control to throw a curveball. And so that's a great comment by the listener, and it kind of reinforces, as you say, our discussions about when the best age to try to throw curveballs really probably is.
The Out of Bounds Show, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Sports injury segment brought to you by Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center and shoulder and elbow specialist Dr. Larry Field. Dr. Field, we appreciate your time today. I know we'll do it again soon.
Great, Bo. Thanks for the opportunity.
Take care.
Have a great day.
Dr. Larry Field, shoulder and elbow specialist, Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center. We started with Jonathan Abram, Benito Jones, both players that had shoulder labrum injuries, and then he walked us through some baseball, pitch count, shutting kids down, and then of course Tommy John surgery. Bo Bounds, Blake Scott. We're live in the Bank Plus studio. Welcome in. ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Some great insight there from Dr. Larry Field.
Yeah, that was awesome. He's one of those guys where, just like Dr. Kraft that we talked to, you want to pick his brain about all these specific. Obviously, we could go down roads of what about this player? What
your
about
mind
this
was
player?
racing. You had a list over there of like 12 players you wanted to hit.
The baseball thing is big because I mentioned to you kind of off air. Baseball parents, we always joke, travel ball dad is the worst sports dad now. Right. That travel ball has turned into what it is, but
the overwhelming majority of them are good. It's the
stereotype.
It's the 10%, maybe 15 that may be high.
There's the same
that
in
are
AAU.
just bat blank crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
Sure. There's
every
good
sport.
there's some really solid good AAU guys, and then there's the filth. But go ahead.
Absolutely. And so, travel ball dad wants his son throwing knuckle curves at 14, and putting up 14 strikeouts a game and a 1.1 ERA.
I grew up with guys throwing curveballs at a young age.
Yes, I did too.
I didn't, but I did.
I was a catcher, so I saw it.
Yeah.
Like I caught my entire life.
I could see you as a scrappy, super scrappy catcher.
Yes, I was Dustin Skelton before he learned how to hit.
Yeah, like someone like you were covered head to toe in dirt.
Yes,
by the
was
second inning.
Very good defensive catcher. He could hit for singles. I've never hit a home run over a fence in my entire life.
Yeah,
true story. I'm a weak little boy,
but you're.
But I got singles and doubles and all that kind of stuff. Like, I was a good average hitter, but I had no power.
I could see red dirt on you.
Mm-hmm.
head to toe.
I was covered in dirt.
Yeah,
as
and
a
just
catcher.
loving every minute of it.
Yeah. There's pictures like my mom had of me when I was like 9 or 10 or whatever, and it's like I've got the mask up on top of my head, like looking at the field or whatever, and I've got dirt like all over my face. Like it's just one of those hot because I'd catch double headers in 100-degree heat.
But see, you grew up in some of the I didn't.
I did play travel
We
ball,
made
yeah.
the All-Star team. We played for 1 or 2 weekends. I didn't grow up at a time in the 80s. There wasn't. They may have been doing it in Dallas and some bigger markets, but it wasn't happening. So now I think you caught kind of the wave of that. Your age group.
Yep.
As far as playing in 15 to 18 tournaments a year,
it was
and
still kind of half
60 games.
It was
and
half booted. You know what I mean? Like people didn't know what they were doing. A lot of the guys, they would get these teams together, and then you'd have like stuff fall apart.
Well, there's a
all
filling
the time.
out process because you
exactly.
don't. Now it's pretty darn refined.
It's a machine.
Yeah,
it's a machine.
And I'll be interested after the pandemic. There are certain sectors and kind of industries that are damn near bulletproof, and you always have a new crop of parents and a new crop of kids that run out on the. I talk about it all. I've already been through this because my kids are now teenagers. But you always have a new crop of parents that run out on the soccer field, softball, and baseball field, and so on. And I just wonder, is it going to go back to like max? Because it was on steroids. I mean, as of March 10th, okay, it was on.
There's people who make their whole living on
1,000 miles per hour
running tournaments.
Absolutely,
they make all their money running baseball tournaments.
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry around the country.
Yeah, and my point of all that was the pressure that those parents then put on themselves and their kids is what I was talking about with Dr. Field when I asked about preemptive Tommy John. Like that, there are literally parents who are, do I get my kid surgery at 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old, in the hopes that it makes him a better pitcher down the road? Like, that's crazy. I'm not putting my kid under the – I don't even have a kid, but I'm not putting him under the knife.
Well, you can almost tie it back into what we were talking about with Michael Jordan.
Phil and the winning
at all cost mentality.
What it takes.
We are a super competitive society, and that is both good a lot of the time and bad some of the time, a detriment to us some of the time. But look, America is all about a scoreboard, and it always will be, regardless of sector and industry. And we are where we are. The Out of Bounds Show, presented by Mississippi Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Center. Shout out and thank you to Dr. Larry Field, shoulder and elbow specialist, for jumping on today. The show is also brought to you by Edwin Watts Golf Shop on County Line Road. That's where you can pick up your next driver, putter, your irons, your wedge, your golf balls, and all your golf gear, merch, and accessories. And then you can head out to Dancing Rabbit Golf Club or Live Oaks Golf Club. Edwin Watts Golf Shop, County Line Road, open for the biz. Go see Carrie and the team at Edwin Watts Golf Shop on County Line Road. The show is also powered by Superior Foundation. For all your foundation repairs, Superior Foundation, superior.ms. We're live in the Bank Plus studio. Hour number 2 coming up. The show is also brought to you by Went McGee, the mortgage man.